I will introduce some of our panelists. So we have going from, well, I suppose, beside me, moving away from me, we have Robert Walsh, who is the Northern Ireland Marine Task Force Officer representing a coalition of environmental NGOs with a key focus on marine environmental policy to ensure healthy, productive and resilient seas. And as a task force officer, Robert coordinates responses across the member organisations to provide scientific advice and improvements on marine policy. I said I'd move in the left direction, but I think next I'll go to Tori, because Tori and Robert are both sort of working in the, I guess, policy sphere, but Tori comes more into perhaps a community level of working. Tori is the Marine Engagement Officer at Ulster Wildlife, with a focus on marine protected areas. So that's something we might touch on as well, that came up in the Fair Seas film, for sure. So Tori is working to ensure that marine protected areas are effective in achieving improved marine biodiversity and marine recovery, not only for nature, but for communities who interact with the marine environment. Then coming from just down the road, we have Dane McPartland, who is a veteran scientific diver, instructor, and founder of Oceanauts Diving, which is an SSI dive centre located along the shore of Carlingford Lough. Dane has had 2 decades experience as a diving professional, with over a decade working in the Middle East as a marine research specialist and dive safety officer for the New York University of Abu Dhabi. And he hopes to share his experience and train new divers to be passionate about protecting our marine ecosystems. And we have Claire Casey, and Claire is the Northern Ireland coordinator for Sea Search, which is I've lost your description, but Sea Search is an organisation that works with divers both in the UK and Ireland. So there are coordinators, I believe, in England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, Republic of Ireland, Jersey, Guernsey, and all of them are coordinating underwater research activities with diving clubs. And then finally, Martha, who's already done a fantastic job of introducing herself. So since we're located right here with this beautiful look out on Carlingford Lough, and we've sort of had a bit of an insight into what's going on in Kerry and in other parts of the island, I think I'd like to start with Dane, because you have, when was the last time you were under the Lough?
2 days ago.
2 days ago, fantastic. So you have, just as Martha has her very recent experience of finding the skate eggs on the beach, I wondered if you could give us a little bit of an insight, because looking out from here, obviously we have beautiful mountains, we have blue sea, but could you give us a little bit of an insight as to what's actually going on underneath there, as someone who has that unique perspective?
Well, actually, so it was something that you said there about like the biodiversity and about not really knowing how diverse an area is, because it's hidden, it's underneath the water. And for me, so I worked away, I lived abroad for a long time, and I lived somewhere that had very tropical waters and coral reefs and all that sort of stuff. So living there and being told, coral reefs are these hyper diverse places and everything, and you come back home and get into the water here again, and sort of, it was almost kind of like an eye-opener for me to come back and go, well, this is even more diverse than what I was dealing with, because you have all these different ecosystems that are just kind of hidden. So obviously you've got your seaweed, seagrass that you're interested in, then even like the silk and things like that. Like each one of them all has their own organisms that live there. So, and we have some, what would we call like, the big charismatic kind of creatures. So where I do a lot of my training and where I take people, to sort of start off would be Greencastle Bay, because it's this nice little sandy area, and you can just walk in off the shore, and there's these kind of like rocky outcrops, and in and around the rocks, they're just covered with crustaceans. So you have shore crabs, and you would have, if you're lucky, you get some of the big brown crabs, the edible crabs, and as you go a little bit deeper, then you can run into then lobsters, and it's just this like plethora of life, like everywhere you look, to the point where there's been times whenever I'm training divers and I'm literally having to like shoo crabs away from them. There's literally that many of them around Greencastle. So it's just stunning to see. But even standing there on the beach and you look across, and there's a small island out there just in the mouth of Carlingford Lough, and it's normally covered in seals, So we have seals there. We have, if anybody is familiar with some of the areas around the loch, there's a dolphin that was out, the bottlenose dolphin that was up at the shore, who was quite well known for sort of swimming along beside the ferry, or jumping out of the water around the boats. And we've had other species of dolphin. I think there was common dolphins that were there as well during last summer. So we do have everything. There's so much life to see, and I think that's one of the main things for me whenever I take somebody who's new and they want to get into the water and they want to start exploring things, and maybe they're a wee bit well, what am I going to see? So you sort of start them off on the shore and go, okay, well, you might be familiar with some of these things because you might see them at low tide, but the second you then go a little bit lower and you go below that low tide mark, then everything changes, because you're going to find things that don't actually come up above that, and that stay hidden down there. And that's kind of really where, for me, it's like that's the magical part. You get to show people stuff that they would never see otherwise.
And that's something, I feel like this panel is slightly biased in that we have at least 3 divers on it. And in a similar way to Dane, I think I sort of studied marine ecology and then thought, right, I've got to leave Ireland now to go and actually find things to go and look at and work on and study. And then came back, and just a couple of years ago was the first time I dived in Carlingford Loch, and I had never seen so many starfish or lobsters or crabs. Yeah. Like, there are crabs everywhere in this loch, it's mad. But there is, I'd like to come on to Claire, because that sort of experience that you can have now, something I'd really like to come on to in a minute is the sort of accessibility, because not everyone has that access to actually going underwater and being able to look in the sea in that way as a diver might. But a lot of us are engaging with the sea on a daily basis. I just want to point out that I'm looking out the window right now, and is that a curragh that's rowing along? Yeah. There's 3 guys there pulling on oars. So there's a multitude of different ways of engaging with the sea. So I'd like to ask you about, firstly, how Sea Search actually takes those diving experiences and turns them into sort of stuff that can be used scientifically. But maybe we could come on then to the actual accessibility of that, and of accessing those kinds of experiences and that kind of understanding of the sea.
Okay, so Sea Search, don't know, is there anybody from Sea Search? Any Sea Search volunteers in today?
I know there are at least 2.
Nice to meet you. Yeah, that's what I'm hoping for. So Sea Search has actually been in operation in the UK for over 30 years now, 35 this year. So it has been going for quite some time. In Northern Ireland, I believe records started around the early noughties. In terms of, sorry, the first part of your question was in relation to how, right, okay. So in terms of how the project works, and we'll be sort of generally engaging, or when the project first started out, the primary target would have been recreational divers. So the idea was to give them the tools that they needed. It wasn't necessarily about improving ID. Identification skills are a journey that you need to go on your own. It's something that you just constantly need to improve at. And I think that's something that's really important, that as we get older, we all tend to get into these habits of just routine. And we don't think our brains have the plasticity anymore to learn things, me included. And I think things like this, like citizen science projects, they do help to engage our brains in ways that we might not normally do in our day-to-day jobs. Once we've gotten to the humdrum of, this is the job that I do every day, we're not challenging ourselves anymore. And I think that citizen science projects are a really, really good way to actually improve our mental health and the plasticity and our actual ability to recall information. But what the project aims to do in terms of teaching people is to give them the protocols that they need to follow. So it's trying to bridge that gap between the aloof, rather exclusive world of science and bring it into a sort of a more accessible, more understandable and digestible format for someone who isn't necessarily from a scientific background. So one of the most important things about science is repeatability. So it's making sure that when you're going to a site to do your survey, you're doing the exact same thing every time, you're collecting the exact same information. So it's ensuring that protocol is standardized all the way through. So that's really what, whenever we're doing our observer courses, when we're training people up, the thing that we're really trying to hammer home is the methodology. The identification stuff comes second. And as I say, it's a learning curve. So your first survey form that you fill in will be a lot different looking to maybe one that you do after 20 plus surveys. So I think it's really, really important in terms of accessibility as well, and to, as I say, demystify aspects of scientific work, is that we try to avoid things like jargon, things like, while we do sort of promote the use of scientific names, we don't want people to feel, what's the word I'm looking for, put off by it, because you can go to maybe a scientific conference or something, and the way that people talk, just their language and the way that they structure their sentences, you can just be sitting going, I have no idea. And that can make you feel extremely excluded from, yeah, very alienated, yeah. And that means that you're excluding people who are intrinsic to the protection of their local communities, their local habitats. We can't sort of get buy-in from politicians, from legislators, from people who can actually make the changes at that level, unless we have the buy-in from the people who actually live there. And the people who live there, unless they actually know what's going on, what's in their local environments, that their local environments actually are super diverse and should be protected, and that they can actually take actions themselves to enact that change, then that's something that, that's something that we really sort of want to try and engage with, as well as accessibility. You've mentioned that diving is quite a pricey pastime. You have so many fees to pay. You have the upkeep of all your equipment and stuff like that. So Sea Search, while it was primarily aimed at divers, we are trying to diversify out. So we are aiming to get people who maybe would rather do snorkeling, much more affordable. All you're really paying for then is the likes of your mask, snorkel, and your fins, and wetsuit, unless you're brave enough to go in without. So things like that, or doing intertidal surveys, are good sort of, I think, entry points for people who maybe feel like they have an interest but don't feel like they don't have the background knowledge to break into citizen science in sort of that marine sphere. I think it's a nice sort of building block. You start off with intertidal, work your way up, getting into the sea with snorkeling, and then eventually we'll coax you out under the water with diving. That's the plan, anyway.
And it's when you have, I mean, those sort of Latin names are something that I struggle with quite a bit, and you have this challenge because the sea, having so many creatures in it that aren't seen on a regular basis, a lot of things don't have common names. Like anyone walking on the land sees a fox and knows what a fox is, but whenever you see a particular kind of nudibranch that's down there that's about this size and only has a Latin name because no one ever sees it, so no one ever thought to name it with something that's a sort of a common name, it makes it far more difficult to actually I mean, you might recognize it. There are creatures I see on a regular basis, but I haven't got a clue what they're called because they only have a two-part Latin name that I cannot hold my head.
This is one of the really nice things about Sea Search as well, is that we encourage people to record what they say regardless of whether they know what it is. Now, we stress, do not guess. If you don't know what it is, that is absolutely fine. But you can describe what it is. So if you have an idea of what you're looking at is a seaweed, for example, you can explain that it's a filamentous green, it's bushy, or it's flattened fronds that branch equally.
Yeah.
So you can use descriptive words, and that in itself can give us an idea, because Sea Search isn't really about getting big, long species lists of what species exist in which area. It's about building a bigger picture. The information that we're collecting is more about the context of the area that those species exist in. So we want to learn about what is the seabed type like there? What's the seabed cover like? Is it covered in brittle stars? Is it covered in seaweed? Is it covered in bryozoans? It's to get that wider picture so we can understand why certain species exist in certain areas and why certain hydrological effects have certain impacts on the communities that we're seeing. It's so we can kind of contextualize what is going on in a wider picture. And that then helps us to inform things like the designation of marine protected areas and prevention of destructive activities within these delicate areas as well.
Yeah.
So yeah.
So those sort of, we saw, some bits and pieces in the film about marine protected areas, and that's obviously something, Tori, that you work specifically on. There is, this sort of worldwide drive at the moment for protecting 30% of marine areas by 2030. And there is a certain sort of, in a way that even, there's a risk, I think, there of even pushing people further from accessing knowledge of the sea. If they're like, we want to remove humankind from this, we want to remove certain pressures, but still want to have certain kinds of engagement. But I wondered, so just, I guess we're building up a picture here. If we're moving from then, gathering this kind of information, this sort of scientific data underwater, and building understanding as well among the people who are gathering that data, I'm just wondering for either Robert or Tori, then how that kind of work bridges a gap between the kind of community level gathering information, gathering understanding, and that actually having effects at sort of policy level, or how it empowers communities to have that kind of effect. I don't know if this is something, Martha, that you might have something else to say as well on, but that kind of, empowerment and having that kind of voice at a meaningful level that then enacts change.
Yeah, I'll start with that. So I suppose it's kind of been touched on a little bit earlier, is that people won't take an interest in something if they don't understand it to begin with. You can't get designations put in place unless people want it to go in. And a lot of coastal communities are home to fishermen, aquaculture industries. There's so much that goes on of different marine users that you cannot put you can't put the policies in place to protect something without having buy-in from those individuals to begin with. And you need to be able to demonstrate the spillover effects from having those things in. The whole point of a marine protected area is to provide protections to species that are vulnerable to various pressures. Our marine environment is becoming much busier as time goes on. You've not just got, industry pressure, you've got offshore renewables, you've then got the overarching ones of climate change, of temperature, ocean acidification. And, Claire was saying, we use a lot of jargon that makes policy inaccessible to members of the public. So breaking down those barriers helps to bridge that gap. And it's work that between myself and Tori, we're hoping to kind of build that more and kind of raise awareness of, what is needed from marine protected areas, what is needed from community, why community should really care. Fair Seas are pushing for their 30 by 30. In Northern Ireland, we've got 38% already designated, but without effective management measures in place, you've got lines drawn on a map. It doesn't do anything unless you've got effective management in place.
Yeah, the fisherman in that Fair Seas video, he did touch on that. He was saying that, it's all right superimposing these MPAs on the SACs and different designations that already exist, but if the management isn't good enough to protect them, or if it isn't in place, what's the point? We have, as Robert was saying, the 38% coverage of marine protected areas in Northern Ireland. So we're surpassed our 30 by 30 target, but the management plans that are in place are not really in place. Basically, they've been based on projects and the outcomes of which are questionable, and it really is in our interest to try to push for better management of these marine protected areas. But that does start at a community level, looking at what activities are going on in these areas, and looking at collecting data as well in these marine protected areas. So I guess that's the difficulty, but we're getting there. We have a marine protected area strategy, which is due to come out soon. But given the political climate in Northern Ireland, you can imagine that a lot of these things have been delayed, or they're sitting on a MLA's desk somewhere waiting to be signed off. So we're waiting to see what that tells us. And that'll be mine and Robert's job to read through that, see if there's gaps, which there more than likely will be. And then the intention after that is to incite more citizen science, whether in the guise of Sea Search or Shore NI or Shore Search, which is a part of the trusts, to try and fill those gaps that'll ultimately come out of those strategies, and hopefully try to break them down to make them a bit more accessible. I guess that's our job, to make all of those policies and all of those documents just that wee bit more accessible.
So that's, yeah, Martha, how do you sort of bridge that kind of gap from the community perspective?
Yeah, I suppose like I went from maybe knowing that there was a dandelion growing on the sand dune to knowing practically every flower now. There are only two scientific names I know. Lutra lutra is the Eurasian otter, and Epidalia calamita is our natterjack toad, but they're the only two I can remember. Everything else is the common name. I would go one further than the information point. Obviously, we need information on our species. But for me, it was I got to care about them. So I care about these little terns that are flying from Central Africa, these small little birds. They're fighting off gulls on the beach, you know. They can even fight off a gull from coming and raiding their nest. But then we come along with our kayaks and go, oh, look at those lovely terns. They're coming at us, dive bombing into us. Why are they doing that, you know? And it's, again, like, I'll hold my hand up. I didn't know about these species or how they lived or how they operated or the ecosystem, you know, that they survive on, and how we impact on that. And I suppose when you learn that and when you care about these creatures, then you become really protective about your place. And I go back to the creative arts, the power of the storytelling here to bring the science to life for the general population. I mean, that has really driven us, and we've created our own spotter sheets, you know, with the help from the experts. But I think the fact that you learn incrementally. So you might start off, like I'm in going to Maharees for quite a long time. And I remember there was a smell in the air in July, and I used to always say, that's the smell of Maharees. And there were these yellow flowers, and I never connected the smell with the yellow flower. But I've since learned that's ladies' bedstraw that's creating that smell every July. And so you learn bit by bit, and then suddenly your knowledge just reaches that tipping point where you know everything about your place. And we're so, you know, happy to share that then with the rest of the community and our visitors. So I think for us, it's just this, again, knowing what you have in your place and really being protective about it.
Yeah, and that's, I suppose, knowing your place and having an understanding of it, and that's such a, like, spending time there and is one way, I guess, of learning about it and having access to that kind of information. But there's a whole world then that you sort of have to navigate in order to enact the kind of change that you then want to protect that world. So how did you sort of bridge that kind of knowledge gap in kind of accessing, I suppose, working through people like Robert and Tori, who are sort of working in community engagement from the sort of organisational or political level, and also from a funding perspective, because, you know, the conservation organisation is largely made up of volunteers, and you then want to carry out projects in your local area. So how did you navigate that sort of political, organisational and funding sort of barrier, I guess?
Well, it's evolved, I'll tell you that, since we started. I mean, again, I said it at the start, none of us was an ecologist. We didn't know anyone in any of these agencies. So I suppose when you start out as a community group, you're an unknown entity. You are a risk to any state agency to get involved because they don't really know who you are or what you're about. So I suppose a lot of the starting point was getting to know the state agencies, the NGOs who can help you, understanding what funding pots are out there, going for a small one first with a small project to prove your sort of bona fides, you know, show that you're a good actor, show that you're aware of designations and you're not trying to do anything that would affect that. And I suppose for us then it was really about promoting our work. So again, telling the stories on social media, public engagement. Even again, I go back to the walks and talks that we do with our visitors in our community and with the experts. So we're all learning together, because an expert is going to talk about maybe what they think we want to know, but we will often go, oh, look at that, and I wonder what about that, and then there'll be even a cross exchange between members of the public, you know, not the experts. They'll be telling each other things, and there's a lovely social aspect. You're outside in nature, and it's just I just can't I don't know how to express how powerful that is. So promoting that, selling the success stories. Obviously, after 1 year, our June had recovered so much. That photograph went viral across the country, I think. I think then really it's about collaborating. So finding your, fair seas, for us it was the National Parks and Wildlife Service, the Kerry County Council, Creative Ireland. Who can you work with actually to achieve your objectives and come up with projects that are aligned with the partner's objectives? So and also coming to events like this, because you never know who you're going to meet. You're always going to meet someone who's useful to you. And I think for me, at the start, I wasn't into public speaking. I wasn't, an ecologist. I had, very little knowledge really of sand dune ecology. But the very fact that we were trying and making an effort, I think people value that as well. They can see that passion, and that really attracts good actors to come your way too.
Yeah, just to note on that, it was really great to see your presentation earlier, because I just want to sort of enforce that top down is always a lot of what the marine protected areas are about, or trying to conserve them. And there's been a definite shift, definitely within the trusts, to have a more community voice method and community-led protection of these areas. And it is the local community that are inevitably using the marine area and are going to have that interest and develop that interest. And so we, as the trust, would really like to develop that community voice method. So we'll be looking into that, but it's in the infancy. But yeah, it's really, really great to see what your association has been able to achieve, and maybe we can set up one for Carlingford. But it'd be great for all of our sort of areas around the coast to have something similar. Yeah.
And this is perhaps, it seems to be sometimes the case in these kind of events that there's sort of one community voice on the stage who's kind of having to almost speak for everyone in a sense. But then we're looking out at the loch now, and I'm just wondering, it looks absolutely beautiful, pristine. You've sort of described the things that you see underwater, but there are pressures on it. And I guess in the same way that in the Maharees project you identified certain pressures that were facing the loch, I wondered if you'd just, before we turn to questions, there's no time for questions. Okay.
But there are workshops.
There are workshops, okay. What kind of, and I guess for anyone who's up here, what kind of pressures are the seas around this area facing now? Because in the Mahar, you have we have sort of global issues of climate change and acidification and all these issues that are sort of seem very conceptual and perhaps aren't so visible on the ground, and we're constantly being told at the moment to think global and act local. So I'm asking from a kind of thinking local perspective instead, because it can be a bit intangible, the sort of issues that the seas are facing, and there's something that sort of seemed to absorb a lot of problems. So what is it that's actually visible here, and that are actually the sort of local issues then that are being faced in the sea?
Yeah, so I mean, there's several pressures to me that would be immediately visible on the loch. Obviously, we have two ports, so we've got Greenore and then we have Warren Point, and that comes with its own pressures in terms of noise and pollution and things like that. Big ships, obviously, at the moment there's a dredging barge that's going up and down doing maintenance dredging,
Watching it all morning.
Yeah, it was going up and down this morning. So obviously that affects the turbidity in the water, so the amount of sediment, things that get kicked up into the water, and that can affect fish. And you could talk about studies that show like how that displaces certain species of fish and things like that to basically get out of the way of big sediment plumes. But for me, the most visible one is actually just pollution, like litter. And where I do a lot of my dive training and things like that, the stuff that you find on the beach would surprise you in terms of what you run into. And down quite deep as well, you'll find stuff like I found crisp packets at like 30 meters underwater, you know. There is a thing as well with storms and stuff coming into the loch. We do have aquaculture on the north side of the loch, and there's quite a few bags. So the oysters that they grow there, they're in these big like sort of plastic nets, and there's quite a few of them at Greencastle at the moment, like sort of half buried in the sand after the storm, so they get pulled off the racks. There's also these sort of rubber straps that I find all over the place at the moment, and again, they're used for that. So, but even just, you know, further up the beach, summertime, like you said in Maharis, like the summer times can be pretty bad for that. I mean, it was great to see people enjoying the shore and being down on the beach and seeing everything and being in the water. But yeah, the stuff that gets left behind, unfortunately, is there can be quite a lot. And then, you know, the tide comes in and that all ends up then out in the loch. So that, to me, was a big point. And I try and like fill my pockets on a dive with anything I find, and try and, you know, just...
Literally, you mean not like starfish?
No. Yeah, not taking crabs and things like that with me, no. But yeah, just like little things like that, like those straps that I was talking about. If I find, you know, plastic bottles, crisp, you know, things like that, I'll try and, you know, lift all that stuff. But, you know, I'm only one man, and, you know, and that's only one little stretch of beach that I am frequenting all the time. You know, I know that there's several other divers in the room here, and I'm sure they would probably echo the same thing, that you do find, you know, quite a bit on dives. And, you know, I know people do try and, you know, clean up after themselves, but yeah, it seems to be, especially after summer times, things like that, it can be quite bad, yeah.
So I think after the coffee break, we're going to have a little introduction from Dave Wall, the National Biodiversity Data Centre, about how things that we find on the shore can give an indication of what's going on underwater. And I suppose there we're seeing that it's not only giving an indication of the kind of life that exists underwater, but also the kind of pressures and issues that there are down there. So we'll come on to that straight after the coffee break. I'm afraid we have to cut it off. I kind of want to keep on chatting for hours and hours and hours, but I'm very sorry we sort of have to cut short. Thank you to everyone on the panel very, very much.